Okay, so we're talking about the first conscription crises in Canada, and that is the conscription crisis in World War One. So, at the start of World War One, again, you need to understand that there are really different perceptions about what's happening in the world in terms of Canada's relationship to this war. So, if you're a British Canadian, as World War One breaks out in 1915, um, not 1915. Someone can check that for me. Um, Fighting for Britain and fighting for the British crown is seen as a patriotic duty, right? And that sort of means a perception that, of course, Canada is going to war, which is fine because in 1915, Canada doesn't have the choice to go to war. They go to war because Britain declared war, and the second Britain declares war, Canada's at war as well. So there's that kind of piece. But in most of Anglophone Canada, there's this perception of fighting the war because Britain is fighting a war, right? As sort of a form of patriotic duty. Okay, and there are a lot of students who go, yeah, but didn't the francophone population of Quebec sort of feel the same way about fighting because the French were fighting and like France was in that war? And the answer I give them is no, 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 no. Remember that Treaty of Paris back in 1763, where essentially the French crown is like, we'd rather keep Barbados than give up. And you can keep the populate, like you can keep our colonies in North America. We'll keep the tropical ones with the sugar. And they sort of say like the French crown sort of steps back and allows the English crown to come in and create all kinds of really ridiculous restrictions about whether or not francophones can hold office, that kind of thing. So as far back as 1763, the francophone population of Canada really feels pretty darn disconnected from really any attachment to the monarchs in Europe. They don't care. So from their perspective, as far as they're concerned, World War One is a problem that is happening in Europe, and it is not their responsibility to fight it. Okay. Now, partially because Canada doesn't make its own choices in this war. Okay. In in 1916, Prime Minister Robert Borden decides that he doesn't have enough troops, so he's going to institute a draft. Okay? And that means that they essentially run a lottery and they sort of collect names and they draw some names out and they send letters to those people and say, by the way, you are responsible to show up for military service, whether you want to or not, because the government says so. And this is sort of understood as an acceptable practice in English Canada because from their perspective, if fighting this war is a patriotic duty and they don't have enough soldiers, then you just like name people until you've sort of met that patriotic requirement. Great. In Quebec, not so much. Not so much. So this policy causes riots in Quebec, as in there are people in the street protesting, and there causes a lot of violence in between linguistic groups to sort out that tension. Um, and I should also sort of point out that there's also like an understanding of what's happening here and how important those summons are, in that our best guess is that about 40% of the francophone population who's conscripted never shows up for military service. So 40% of them are just like, no, you can't make me. And that sort of idea about like as far as the francophone population is concerned, they're not showing up for the draft because it's not their war to fight and it's stupid and they're not going to go fight and die for it. As far as most of Anglophone Canada is concerned, they're not showing up because they're cowards, because they're afraid of war, because they're afraid of violence, and because they're not really men. And that's sort of this kind of conversation that becomes really important. Just for context, in 1916, we're not conscripting anyone who's female. That's not a thing. You can volunteer for service as a nurse, but women had to fight for that right. So we're not talking in this particular case about sort of you're not a patriotic Canadian. It's about you're not a man if you are afraid to go fight this war. Okay. Um, I don't know if you guys caught that when I was sort of talking about the number of francophone conscripts who don't show up. And I said approximately 40%. And I want to sort of dive in a little bit, not too terribly much, to that idea about approximately. And one of the things you need to remember about this is that it's still 1916, which means that all of the records are paper, right? If something goes down and like there's something bad that happens at a particular government office, say the CRA, it's not that we have no idea who owes how much in taxes because all of that data is stored and backed up on other computer services, that kind of thing. That's not the case in 1916 because the records have to be kept in hard copy. So, one of the reasons we say approximately is because when we talk about riots in Quebec, part of what we're talking about is people literally going down to the draft offices and setting fire to them. Which means that we lose, I mean, if you're the government of Canada, you lose the draft office and sort of the real estate and that kind of challenge. Um, but if you're sort of a social scientist coming later, you also go, we don't really know how many people failed to show up. We think it's about 40%, but we don't have any records because they burnt in these fires that were intentionally set. And it is also important to sort of understand that that's not an accident. One of the reasons that you burn draft offices, or that Francophone Canadians burn draft offices in 1916 in Quebec, is because if you can't prove that I was drafted, you can't punish me for not showing up. So there's that kind of challenge around who is doing what, and that sort of conversation about conscription in World War One. What's really important to understand when we start moving into the second conscription crisis in Canada is that this experience of conscription in World War One, of not only being conscripted to fight a war that you don't think is yours to fight, and having to have riots in the streets to sort of get away from that experience, but also being called a coward for saying, dude, that's not my war to fight, that's not my king. And sort of creating, there's a deepening divide between Anglophones and Francophones at this point in time, and it definitely leaves a bad taste in the mouth of Canada's Francophone population at this point in time. So keep that in mind when we start talking about the conscription crisis of World War II, because if you don't have that context, the one in World War II kind of goes, what's the big deal? But it is a really big deal if you place it in that context of there's already a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths because of this sort of earlier experience in 1916.